Well, hey friends, I've had enough caffeine today to prevent a bear from hibernating. So if I talk entirely too fast or am a little bit twitchy, I hope you will understand why. I am recording again outside today because it is lovely. I will once again say that the street had been completely quiet until I hit the record button. And then we had a diesel truck and a car and I guess, plane working its way by, all fire through. So sorry about that. We are continuing on our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are halfway through chapter 22, and we'll finish it out today. We've got three kind of conflict passages to look at in the closing week of Jesus' life. And these are all really important markers for Jesus' own ministry, but also important reminders for the early church that Matthew writes to. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we work our way through. Again, I am going to ask you to pause the video and read through the verses that are here. It is a little bit more than what we've done the last couple of weeks, but I am wanting to, get through Matthew at some point in 2023. So we'll take a few slightly larger chunks along the way and try to make time to take a look at maybe a little bit larger piece of Matthew as we go. Tonight's verses are verses 15 through 46 of Matthew chapter 22. I think I may have said 23 a second ago. Of Matthew chapter 22. So what I would like for you to do right now is go ahead and hit pause on the video. Read through chapter 22, verses 15 through 46. And then when you have finished reading through those verses, go ahead and hit play again, and we will continue the conversation. Welcome back. So you see conflict in these verses with the Pharisees, which is not unusual, with the Sadducees, which is a little bit different than most of Jesus' conflicts, because we'll talk about the Sadducees specifically in a minute. And then with a guy designated as a lawyer, and we'll talk about that role when we get to those verses, but don't think in terms of modern lawyer. That's more along the lines of a professor of theology, somebody who is an expert in the Torah, and somebody who teaches the finer points of Old Testament law to others. So first, the Pharisees and the Herodians, which is an interesting pairing, because in most contexts, those are not people who would get along. The Pharisees are people who, we've talked about them before, are hyper dedicated to keeping the law as perfectly as possible. They are based not in Jerusalem and not in the temple, but in the countryside, in the synagogues. They are very much the leaders of the people. They are the kind of community, rural-based religious leaders. The Herodians are people who have sided up with Herod. So whereas the Pharisees tend to be more rural, more working class, they'll have jobs to support themselves, but live in the countryside. They are not a fan of the Romans for the most part. They are not a fan of Herod. They find out that, some of Herod's people are after Jesus at one point, and it's some Pharisees that warn Jesus about that. In this case, they are united by a common enemy. And for both of them, finally, at this point, the enemy is Jesus. And so they team up and come to Jesus with this trap. And they start with some very flattering words. We love how honest you are. So now handle this hot potato question. And the question is set up in a way to get Jesus to take one of two paths. Either to be anti-Roman government, and by being anti-Herod and anti-Roman government, set him up for arrest by those entities as a dangerous revolutionary, or to be pro-Roman government and lose credibility with the people who are following him. And so they throw out this question about taxation. Now, the tax that they ask about specifically is a census-based tax that did not exist until the year 6 CE, so when Jesus was a kid. And as you can imagine, it was not loved by the majority of people. It is 1 denarius, no matter who you are. And so if you're already wealthy, denarius is not a big deal. If you are not, then it is a much bigger deal. And absolutely everyone has to pay it. It's a head tax, a census tax, a poll tax, however you want to describe it, that's what it is. And it's not just that it's a tax, which, has not been loved by people for a very long period of time. It's what the tax has to be paid with that is a huge problem, especially located in Jerusalem, where Jesus is when this story takes place, and in the temple courts, which is where this conversation is happening. And the problem is that it's paid with a Roman coin that has the image and title of the Caesar on it. And so these coins are stamped and minted with his image and a claim to being divine, which was part of his title that's stamped on the coin. Now, you probably don't have to think too hard about why that would be a problem for the Jewish community, especially in Jerusalem and in the temple. So here Jesus is with a crowd around him in a heavily populated place in a very loaded context, and he's tossed this live grenade of a question. And there are 2 things that I really love about what happens next. First, Jesus gets the Pharisees to betray themselves. So there they are in the temple courts, and Jesus says, "Hand me a coin," which means he doesn't have it on him. He doesn't pull one out of his own pocket, and it's, a Pharisee who reaches into their coin purse in the temple courts and pulls out this blasphemous coin, which the majority of people would have probably carried in the courts. That's not really here nor there, but they've got one on them, which shows that they may not be fans of the tax, but they are paying the tax and are participating in the system. That's step 1 that I love. And 2, after Jesus makes his point, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, it doesn't say that he gives the coin back. Now, maybe he did, but I very much love the image of them paying Jesus a day's wage to make them look foolish in front of a crowd. In between those 2 points, Jesus renders that teaching that most of us know pretty well: render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And there are 2 different ways that I think we can read that. One is pretty traditional reading. We participate in a society in some ways of which we have little to no say over, and part of being a decent citizen is participating in that system and giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, whether or not we like it. But the other question, I think, points us back to another one of Jesus' teaching: no one can serve 2 masters. And maybe there's a bigger question here about how we participate in the systems in which we live. And I don't know that that's what's going on, but because we've got some of those other some of those other teachings from Jesus, this may very well be a challenge to the Pharisees to think about what kingdom they are prioritizing, because they may be verbally against the Roman government and its, existence and control in their world, but they certainly benefit from it. And they have not gone as far as like the Essenes have to go full-on revolution. And maybe Jesus is asking a hard question about whether or not they are as, more highlighting just how hypocritical they are, which is a word that he uses to describe them at the very beginning. They're happy to speak against some part of the Roman system, but they're perfectly comfortable living under it in the grand scheme of things. So they're amazed by his reply, and they go away. And then he gets some Sadducees. And this is one of those passages that I think has confused many of us for a very long period of time, because the teaching that Jesus renders in response, the one about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being what he says to Moses, doesn't make a lot of sense. Or if we were trying to talk about resurrection from the Old Testament, that's definitely not the passage that we would go to. So they pose him this question about a woman and 7 brothers and the Levirate marriage system, and you can read some of your Old Testament law for some background on that. But the gotcha question is, so who is the woman going to be married to in the afterlife? And they don't really care about the answer. Their goal is not to get an answer. Their goal in this is to get Jesus to say, well, you got me there. There must not be a resurrection. But what you need to know about the Sadducees may help make some sense of Jesus' response, is that there are only 5 books of our Old Testament that they consider to be Scripture. And that was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Torah, the 5, the Pentateuch, however you want to term it. Those are the only ones that matter. So they don't read the law. They only read the law. They don't read the prophets. They don't care for wisdom literature. They're not interested in the Psalms. It is those 5, the books of Moses, period. So Jesus is limited to how he can respond to them and what scripture he can reference that they will understand, that they will believe valid, that they will... Sorry, I just nearly witnessed an accident here in front of our building. Glad everybody came out of that one okay. And so, Jesus reaches for something that we would consider obscure. And then this moment when God is in conversation with Moses, and he doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. He doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham and then of Isaac and then of Jacob and now of you. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which implies an ongoing, continual existence for them. So they live on beyond their earthly existence. And Jesus says God is not the living God of the dead, but of the living. And that's this moment in response. And so the Sadducees' attempt at a gotcha moment with Jesus then comes back in their face. And so we get this next question, because they're all kind of peppering Jesus. They're looking for something, either to cause him to lose popularity or to get him arrested. They are desperate. And so the Pharisees hear that response, and so they come back with this other one. What law is most important? And there are a couple of ways in which this is a loaded question. One is how law was read. And the goal was not to prioritize the law. In fact, it was to recognize the validity of all the law. And so that it's important to keep all of it, to keep everything. Jesus teaches this in some ways, that not one dot, not one iota will disappear from the law. In fact, that it will all be fulfilled, that it will all find its fulfillment and its purpose. And so they ask him to say which is most important. And again, the goal here being, if he picks this one, well, what about this? Are you saying that this is not important? And so Jesus throws out a 2-pronged response that has the same effect as the other conversations that he has. It ends up silencing his opponents. So, what law most important? Jesus says, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and all your mind, which is the Shema. This is something that's recited by the Jewish people multiple times a day in prayer. It is constantly on their hearts and on their lips. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. What they mean by like it is not the same as importance. What he means there is that it is intimately connected to the first. It is the second side of the same coin. You must love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all of the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. And so what Jesus then essentially says is that at the heart of the commandments is this notion of love. He gives them an interpretive lens. to read the law and the scriptures. And if you're reading through law and scripture and not looking for love, then you are missing the key interpretive element that should help you understand what is there. And after these three questions, Jesus then fires back one of his own. And it's this question about, honestly, at its core, it's a question about how they read Scripture. And it's a reference to Psalm 2, which I think is like the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. I'd have to double check. Man, it's been a minute since I've read up on that. But it throws out this reference to the Messiah that comes from the Psalms. And then he gets his own gotcha moment in there as he talks about the nature of the Messiah. And we end in verse 46 with this moment, or this note that says, no one could answer him, and after that, no one dared ask him any more questions. And that's actually the problem for Jesus, is that they've ceased to engage him, which means they've recognized that there's no longer a route in which they are going to be able to bring about his, shrinking in power, and don't know a good way to say that, the minimizing of his impact on society in a way that doesn't involve killing him. And they've been unable to put him in a position, in a public space, where he's going to make himself an enemy of the Roman state. So, they have to now go about it by different means. Chapter 23, Jesus picks up a heavy criticism of the Jewish religious leadership in general. And I want to take a minute here at the end to talk about why that's important. When Matthew writes down these stories of Jesus, it is late in the first century. The temple has been destroyed. The Sadducees have ceased to exist because their power, their role was tied explicitly to the temple. And in some ways to the Herodian government, which no longer exists at this point because Rome held that they are the ones who allowed the revolution to happen in the first place. They're overthrown before the revolution really kicks off, so that's neither here nor there. And the Pharisees who existed in the countryside are finding their place of power. We know that there's some crossover between the Pharisees and the early church. Paul was a Pharisee, and you don't leave behind that training and teaching, those understandings, those systems. Paul still very much participates in synagogue life and in temple life, 2 decades after Jesus' crucifixion, 3 decades after Jesus' crucifixion. And I think sometimes we get in our minds that there's just this automatic separation between the Jewish community and the church community, and that's just simply not the case. So for Matthew's readers, the vast majority of whom are Jewish, who are still, trying to figure out the role that synagogue and Jewish religious tradition play in their lives then, what Matthew is showing them is all the ways in which those traditions fall short of not explaining, but revealing God's purpose in the Messiah and who Jesus was. And so it's not that those, experiences are invalid. It's not that the old law is useless. It's that they need to find their fullest understanding of who God is, what God has done, and what God is doing through Jesus alone. And that's where we've been in the last a couple chapters, really, and where we will continue to be until the moment that they crucify Jesus. So, if you've not done so already, I once again encourage you to sit down and read through all of Matthew's gospel. I think reading it all in one sitting will help bring out some of those differences, not the right word, some of those themes that keep showing up. And if you've done that already, then I hope that you're noticing how some of those threads continue from beginning to end in Matthew's gospel. All right, glad you joined us. We will be back and do this again next week. Bye, y'all. Have a good one.